Hello, you're on Public Spot. I'm George. Welcome to another episode on exploring layers of handling web requests. And in today's episode, I will look into host-based and pattern-based routing to make all my web applications accessible with a single load balancer web proxy. And so if this series and the content of this channel lines up with your interests, hit the subscribe button and join me in this journey of learning by doing. So, let's start coding. Before I start diving into the code, allow me to quickly draw what I have achieved so far. At the start of this series, I set up set of web applications in Docker Compose. So they are my blog application, my Sonar application, and my Radar application. I have set up Nginx as a web proxy to access this application. This means there is no way to access the web applications directly. All requests need to pass through my Nginx web proxy to get to these three other web applications. I set up an EC2 instance that is publicly accessible and runs this set of web applications. And then I introduce a load balancer as another layer of web proxy. My load balancer has access to all my web applications running on my EC2 instance via the target groups configured to interact with my instance on a specific port. In the previous episode, I have set up a web endpoint called main.publicspot.ga to enable TLS and to make the access to the load balancer web proxy more secure. So you've got your end user all the way to the end in front of a computer, accessing my load balancer via the main. But what I have set up so far is limited to access only to the Nginx default web application, which is running on port 8080. So essentially, web traffic is not routed to 8081 and 8082. This essentially means any user who tries to access main.publicspot.ga will only get to my Nginx web application. I need to set up my infrastructure in such a way that access to my blog application, Sonar app, and Radar app are enabled. I will introduce two new web endpoints. And then I will set up routing rules that my load balancer will evaluate to determine where traffic will end up going to. So let me switch to my VS Code and let's start the work. As usual, I'll pull in the latest changes to my local machine and create a branch for today's changes. The first thing that I need to do is set up the new endpoints inside my load balancer Terraform module. And so in my main.tf, I will update the way my Route 53 records are created. I will be pointing all web endpoints to the same load balancer. And so I'll introduce a for each property inside this Route 53 record block. I will use a variable called record names that will contain all the endpoints that I will set. And I have an existing variable called record name that I will modify for this new purpose of having multiple endpoints. So I'll head over to my variables.tf. And then this block right here needs to be renamed to record names. And then I also need to change the type of this variable to a list. And then back to my main.tf. Because the for each takes a map or a set as input, I'll need to convert my record names to a set. And then change the value of my name property to an element of my loop. And now that that's set, I need to go to my load balancer Terragrant configuration file and update the inputs property and add the other record names that I want to set. As far as my diagram is concerned, what I have completed so far are the web endpoints components right here. But at this point, the load balancer knows only one way of routing web traffic, and it is the default forwarding to my Nginx web application. The next thing I need to do is set some smarts on my load balancer to properly route web requests to the intended web application. So back to my VS Code. I need to attach rules into my load balancer listener to allow for routing of web requests to my radar and Sonar application. So if I go back to my main.tf on my load balancer, and then I'll start with the rule for my radar application. I will point the listener ARN property to my load balancer listener resource. And I also need to set priority for this rule. If I set up several rules, the order that these rules are evaluated is based on the priority property in ascending order. So I usually give myself enough buffer between rules to allow me some wiggle room in case I need to introduce new rules at a later stage. So I'll start by setting the priority for this rule to 10. For this listener rule to work, I need to add two important blocks. I need to add the condition and action property. I will be evaluating the host header and check if the web request is intended for radar.publishspot.ga. So I'll update the condition block with this. And if this is the case, I want the request to go to my target group resource that is configured for radar, which is on port 8082. So my action block will look like this. With this particular rule, if I go back to my diagram, what I have accomplished with what I have set up in my Terraform code is allowing web traffic to flow from the web endpoint radar to my radar web application, which will then flow like this. So now back to my VS Code. I need to implement something similar for my Sonar web application. So let me duplicate this block and modify the properties to fit for my Sonar application. I need to change the priority for this rule to 20 and change the host header condition to evaluate for sonar.publishspot.ga. And then I want the action to forward my request to a target group that runs on port 8081. If I go back to my diagram, what I've achieved is allowing my user to access the Sonar endpoint and allow the load balancer to route the traffic to port 8081 all the way to Nginx, and then Nginx will allow access to Sonar. So back to my VS Code. The next routing rule that I need to set is for access to my blogging application. This rule will also be similar to the rules that I've set up. So let me duplicate these and make the necessary modifications to fit it for my blog application. I'm going to change the priority for this rule to 30. And then I want my blog application to be accessible from the main.publishspot.ga web endpoint. So I'm going to change the host header condition for that. And then I need the request to forward to the right target group that runs on port 8080. However, this setup is incomplete. As it is, this rule will route traffic to my default web application, which is what I have set up currently. What I need is an additional pattern-based condition to forward the request properly. And so I need to add a new condition block that evaluates the path pattern of the web request like this. Both of these conditions need to be satisfied in order for the web request to be routed to my blog application. But I also need to modify this to make my load balancer handle potential threats to my web application. So let me go back to my diagram to illustrate. So far, I've set rules 10, 20, and we also have a rule 30 in here that evaluates for goals. It routes the traffic to port 8080 and then to the blog application. My load balancer has been configured to have a default routing rule, which sends the request down to my Nginx web application. So what this means is that any web request that hits my load balancer will always hit my Nginx web application, which is really bad. So in order to fix this, I need to verify the host header of the web request and make sure that it is set to my expected web endpoints. And if this is not the case, I'll return a response code of 401, which indicates unauthorized access. So back to my VS Code. I'll introduce a new rule for my main web endpoint. So I'm going to duplicate this and modify some elements to cater for my main web endpoint. I'm going to change the priority to 40 and get rid of the path pattern condition. And then I need to go to my load balancer listener resource. And I need to update my default action block to return 401 fixed response. And all that's left now is to run my Telegram commands and stand up my infrastructure, and then verify that my web applications are accessible as expected. So I'm going to open my terminal and then head to my Telegram directory, export my AWS credentials as well as my Terraform workspace, and then start running Telegram apply for all my infrastructure resources. And then I'll say yes to this prompt. With my infrastructure now stood up, let me switch to my browser and start verifying my web applications. And I'll start with main.pablospot.ga, which I expect to go to my default Nginx web application, which it does. And then the next is my Radar application, which is accessible through this web endpoint. And it loads my Radar application. And then my Sonar application, that also works fine. My blog application, which is accessible through this endpoint. And lastly, if I try to access my load balancer directly, I get the 401 unauthorized error. And that is all I have for today. In the next episode, I will look into another AWS resource called CloudFront that could act as another web proxy, but is a powerful CDN solution. In the meantime, let me know your thoughts in the comments below and send me some likes if you find this useful. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you like my content and help me spread the word about this channel. Until next time, keep learning and stay safe.